So it's not, so when you criticize, like let's say you criticize the conventional narrative on slavery, colonialism, segregation, South Africa, and the Congo. Okay, it's not really 5 different topics. It's the same topic. It's the same convergent narrative because they all reinforce and they all sort of grow together or die together. Okay, let me put it this way: if you say, for example, that segregation was fine, there's nothing immoral about whites wanting to have their own neighborhood. Let's say you say that. What are you going to be called? You're going to be called a quote unquote racist, and racist in effect only means whites, right? It only means white people not having enough of a positive view of black and brown, right? That's what it means. Or what would be a criticism of saying, well, blacks are being shot by police, but they're actually being shot less than their behavior warrants. What would you be? What are you called if you say that? You're called the same thing, racist. So it's all of a piece. It's all an overarching narrative. It's a single thing, right? It's not. These aren't actually separate issues, and I think at some level, everyone kind of knows that these are not separate issues, that this is all one overarching ideology, this is all one overarching narrative that is being critiqued. And the critiquers are, of course, called, heretics, communists, or race, whatever the term du jour is at your place and time in history, whatever the heretic analog is at your place and time in history. I think I'll end on this. Your perception of discrimination does not mean that you are discriminated against. From a Pew survey in 2016, younger black people reported having experienced discrimination more than those 65 and older. And blacks with college degrees report more discrimination than those without college degrees. Now, of course, this is false. Blacks without college degrees, while blacks in general aren't racially discriminated against, blacks with just a high school diploma almost certainly face more instances of racial discrimination to the extent they exist. Now, in reality, there's anti-black discrimination, pro-black discrimination, anti-white discrimination. There's discrimination all over the place, right? Discrimination, people discriminate all the time, and they racially discriminate all the time. The question is, what is the net effect, right? Are blacks more often discriminated against or discriminated in favor? Are whites more often discriminated against or discriminated in favor? That's how you need to look at this, because that's how the world actually works, right? It's not like everyone is either neutral or everyone is uniformly mildly anti-white or mildly anti-black. What's actually happening in the real world is people have racial biases going in all directions all the time. Okay, when I say blacks have a pro-black or anti-white, when I say whites have a pro-black or anti-white bias of about 1/10 of a standard deviation, I don't mean that all whites have that mild pro-black bias. I'm saying that whites, on the whole, it averages out to 1/10 of a standard deviation pro-black bias or anti-white bias, whichever way you want to look at it. Let's keep going. An NPR survey in 2017 asked blacks if they were ever, or a family member was ever, unfairly stopped or treated by the police. Those 65 or older, i.e. those who were born before civil rights, they were the least likely to say that they were unfairly stopped by police or a family member was unfairly stopped by police. And blacks in suburban areas are more likely to say that they were unfairly stopped, while blacks in the hood were less likely to say so. What this shows is that your belief that you were treated unfairly, it's a product of conditioning. If anyone was being unfairly harassed by the cops, it's going to be blacks in urban areas, and it's going to be the less educated ones who don't get into the urban areas. And older blacks, according to the mythology surrounding segregation, should have been harassed by cops the most. But what actually happened, what you're actually seeing, is that older blacks, they weren't told that they were oppressed as much as blacks are today. They were to a lesser extent, but they weren't told that they were oppressed as much as you are. And urban blacks who are less educated and watch less controlled media, they don't hear about how oppressed they are as much as suburban blacks do, who are more educated. They watch, the journalism blogs, right? They watch CNN and Fox and stuff, right? And so they're told that they're oppressed. So you believe you're oppressed because you're told you're oppressed. There's no relation to actual oppression. This principle is also seen among women. From a Pew survey in 2017, the more quote-unquote educated, years in school, a woman is, the more likely she is to perceive oppression. Even though, if any group of women is being on net oppressed, right, which I don't think is the case at all for any class of women, but according to the narrative, it should be the least educated women who are the most oppressed. But that's not what you see here. The variable here is exposure to ideology. It's perception. And of course, we look at Republican versus Democrat. Democrat women perceive more oppression because their ideology tells them they are oppressed. Do you think Republican women are more or less oppressed than Democrat women? I mean, neither are oppressed, but Republican women probably have fewer bonus points for being a woman than Democrat women, and yet they're less likely to say they're oppressed. And this is actually a dampening effect because Republicans actually have higher levels of education than Democrats. This is true. I'll post a link saying that this is true in the description. Sorry if that rustles your jimmies. Like, sorry, not sorry. But this is true. So the effects of going to college, isolated from ideology, are going to be higher because Republicans are actually more likely to go to college. So if you have a Democrat woman who goes to college and gets a post-grad, she is going to think she is the most oppressed person on the planet. That is a recipe for believing you're oppressed. Being a Democrat and spending lots and lots of years in college, getting a post-grad, you are going to believe that the world is out to get you. If you're a Republican woman who doesn't go to college, you're not going to perceive yourself as being oppressed at all, right? Because you have the least exposure to those narratives. And so all you're dealing with is the world as it's actually presented in front of you. This is also seen by generation cohort, of which gender is thought to have it easier. Older generations see women as having it easier, while starting with millennials, the perception is that men have it easier. Again, it's a matter of ideology. It has nothing to do with reality. This is also seen among Hispanics from a Pew poll in 2016. Older Hispanics are less likely to perceive discrimination, and foreign-born are less likely to perceive discrimination than U.S.-born. Now, according to oppression narratives, foreign-born Hispanics from, say, the 1970s should certainly have been more oppressed than U.S.-born Hispanics today. And yet, that's not what they say. That's not what they believe, because it's all just perception. Foreign-born Hispanics in the 1970s weren't told that they were oppressed. U.S.-born Hispanics today are told that they're oppressed, and people believe what they're told by the institutions that they, for whatever reason, believe as authoritative, right? Like the journalism clubs, like CNN, that's authoritative. From Harvard in 2017, Latinos saying that they were unfairly stopped by police, 42% with a college degree say they were unfairly stopped, while only 25% with high school or less say they were ever unfairly stopped. Again, it's in all likelihood, if any of these groups were unfairly stopped, right, and there's a chance that none of them were in reality, but if any group was being unfairly stopped, it was probably the ones with a high school degree or less, right? Not the ones with a college degree, right? But the college degrees say they were stopped more because they went to college and they were told about how oppressed they are. Blacks are more likely to believe they are discriminated against when interacting with police or trying to vote if they live in a majority black area than in a majority white areas. But if they're in a majority black area, who's doing the discriminating? According to the oppression narrative, shouldn't blacks be most oppressed when they're surrounded by whites? This difference in perception makes sense when you recognize that it's just a result of the spread of ideology, right? When blacks are around blacks, the ideology spreads more than it does when blacks are around whites. It has nothing to do with any actual oppression, because plot twist, there is none. And that's a good point to end on. Now, you can tell stories about some white guy who doesn't like black people or Mexicans or whatever, but those stories are meaningless without considering the net effect. Because there are also white people who are anti-white, blacks who are anti-white, blacks who are anti-black, rather fewer of those, and they get ostracized massively. Hispanics who are anti-Hispanic, Hispanics who are anti-white. And so pointing out that this or that incident happened, like a thing happened, well, that doesn't mean anything. You have to look at the whole effect. And when you look at the whole track of things, well, if you're black, probably if you're Hispanic, but certainly if you're black, Well, it's good news. You're not actually oppressed. Your life and all of its outcomes, that's you. This is you. Right? It's not something that's being done to you by others. If anything, the system is pumping you up, is helping you out in any little way it can. But the effects of anti-white policies and pro-black policies, the effects of these things are actually pretty marginal. There's no real big effect in any of systemic racism or anything. Right? There's probably a mild anti-white effect and a mild pro-black effect, but nothing that's going to affect your life outcomes by like 1 or 2 percentage points. Right? So the effects are small. What's actually happening is that where you are, that's you. Okay, it's you. The system isn't really having much of an effect on you. Now, the deeper cut is that you never were oppressed, and that it is in fact always been you. But that's a whole. I mean, this video would go on for a few hours to go through all that. You can perceive yourself as being put upon no matter what. And whether or not you perceive yourself as being put upon is today entirely a function of your conditioning. Are you a Democrat or Republican? How old are you? Did you go to college? How many years did you go into college? Do you live in a majority black or majority white neighborhood? Those factors right there, those are going to more or less determine how oppressed you think you are. It's going to explain about 70 to 80% of how oppressed you think you are. Now, there's going to be some special snowflakes who, despite being a Democrat in an all-black area with a post-grad, they're not going to think that blacks are oppressed. Right? You'll get the oddball here and there. But on the whole, these factors are going to more or less determine how oppressed you think you are. None of it's real. Keep in mind, you didn't think you were oppressed before any of this was told to you. And this is an experience that black and brown people have, is learning that they are oppressed. And the process of learning that they are oppressed, they have to be told it. They have to go to a class. They have to see a controlled media story, right? They have to see, like Rodney King or something. They have to see, it has to be told to them, right? They don't pick it up through their lived experience. That's the great irony of these claims about lived experience, is that it has positively zero to do with lived experience, right? Because those blacks and Hispanics who are the least connected to propaganda narrative, who aren't on Twitter, for example, they are the least likely to believe they are oppressed. The ones whose lives are most a function of lived experience are the least likely to think they're oppressed. So you have to be told this. This is something that is put into your brain from the top down. Right? This is a controlled narrative pushed onto you. It's not natural. It's not organic to you. Right? It's something that someone else told you to believe, and that's why you believe it. And there's also the problem of how you experience white people in reality versus what the journalism bureaucracies tell you in the run-up to an election. Because of this, you have to say things like, oh, it's the cops, or it's corporations, or, oh, it's those neo-Nazis somewhere over the rainbow, right? It's like that one kid in your class who drew swastikas on the desk, right? He's the source of all your misfortunes, or something ridiculous like that, right? It's some hidden white person. It's not it's some ridiculously small minority of white people, right? Because the white people that you actually know aren't unfair to you, probably, for the most part. I mean, look, every person's a person, okay? But for the most part, this is true. So it has to be institutional racism. But all the institutions have pro-black discrimination. They have affirmative action, right? So what kind of institutional discrimination could there possibly be, right? Or it's implicit racism. But you look at any study that looks at, pro-black or anti-black or pro-white or anti-white bias on all sorts of things, in terms of, oh, how competent is this person? Oh, how much does this person deserve getting money, right? Except for a few minor things like how fat they believe you to be, it's all pro-black bias. And any simulation shows that cops are less likely to pull the trigger on a black person for given identical behavior than they are on a white person. And if you look at how many blacks are killed by police and compare that to the homicide rate and compare that to the percentage of cop killers are black, if anything, blacks are shot less than their proportion in those things. Blacks are underrepresented.